Hey there, it's Pastor Rob here. Thanks for joining me on this sightseeing tour and visit to Geneva, Switzerland. I am standing on top of St. Pierce Cathedral, which is the church where John Calvin ministered for much of his ministerial life. Behind me, you can see the city of Geneva, including the old town, but also you obviously can see many of the skyscrapers and newer buildings. But where we are is the cathedral, is St. Pierce Cathedral. It's a very old cathedral. John Calvin ministered here beginning in the year 1536, but he only served for about 2 years before he was expelled from the city. The city leaders felt that he was too rigid, and they did not like some of the reforms that he was putting in place in the city, and so they expelled him. They kicked him out. From here, Calvin went to Strasbourg in France, where he ministered to French religious refugees. But it was only a number of years later, about 2.5, 3 years later, that Calvin was asked by the city to return to Geneva. Things were not going well in Calvin's absence. The city and the church were struggling greatly, and so they came back to Calvin and they asked if he would return here to Geneva, which he did, and he remained here for the remainder of his life until he passed away. In the next few minutes, we're going to take you through St. Pierce Cathedral. You will have the chance to see his pulpit where he preached. You'll see the communion table where he served communion. You'll see the church itself where he ministered to and preached to his congregation. And in subsequent videos, we're also going to show you his home where he lived and even where he passed away. So thanks for joining me on this. I'm really looking forward to seeing you and to journeying with you on this video. And let's take a tour.
St. Pierce Cathedral stands high atop the old city of Geneva. The first church built in Geneva is dated to the early 4th century. It was a small Catholic church with a chapel and a baptistry. It was around for about 500 years before it was rebuilt in about the early 12th century. That's the church that we have in front of us now. St. Pierce Cathedral can be traced to the mid-12th century when it was completed. It's a tall and imposing structure that you can see from just about any place around Geneva. And this is the place where Calvin led much of his pastoral work. It's where he preached and where he taught. And it's not far from where he lived. By the early 16th century, the teachings of the Reformation are spreading all throughout Europe, and tensions are running high between the Catholic leadership and the Protestant leaders. And there's a question in Geneva of whether or not the city of Geneva is going to be a Protestant city or a Catholic city. The tensions are rising, and the Catholic leadership sends a priest who comes to St. Pierce Cathedral, and he gives a sermon denouncing the Protestants and denouncing the teachings of the Reformation. Well, one of the early reformers of Geneva is present. His name was Froment, and he's there in church for that service. And he stands up and interrupts the sermon, and he challenges the bishop to prove from Scripture what he was saying. And as you might imagine, that didn't go over very well, and so Froment is expelled from Geneva almost immediately. The Catholic Church works to try to de-escalate tensions, and they come to a sort of truce, or at least a willingness to get along, at least for the time being. But that peace was really only temporary. Hostilities are rising against the Protestants during this time, and on Sunday, May 21st of 1536, the people of Geneva voted to become a Protestant city, and it was a unanimous vote, and it took place on the spot right outside of St. Pierre's Cathedral. As soon as that happened, St. Pierre's Cathedral was stripped of all of its Roman Catholic decorations and images and its splendor. It becomes a Protestant church, whereas formerly it had become a Catholic church. The church would have served as a refuge for the many French Huguenots who were fleeing persecution in their native France. The church served as a central point for Calvin's ministry. It was from this pulpit here at St. Pierre's that Calvin preached more than 2,000 sermons, and it was in the auditoire that is just next door that Calvin delivered many lectures during his time in Geneva. There's a chair that is still in the cathedral, and that's the chair that Calvin would sit at during the service. Calvin's health was not very good, and so if on that given Sunday he wasn't feeling very well, he would sit and deliver his sermons from that chair. Calvin was a very thorough preacher. He preached over the 25 years that he was in Geneva. He preached some 2,000 sermons, and these were each an hour long. He preached twice a Sunday and once every other day of the week, and he gave theological lectures during that time as well. He preached verse by verse, chapter by chapter, and book by book, and today the sermons that he delivered are commentaries and are Calvin's commentaries. There's one interesting story that took place inside of this cathedral, and that was in September of, don't remember the year exactly, but at this time, Calvin was engaged in a sharp controversy with a group of people known as the Libertines, and they were people that believed that even though we are saved by grace, we were free to live any way that we chose. We could. There was no need to strive for holiness as a way of life. And Calvin believed that this was not true. Calvin believed that the gospel calls us to a new way of living, to obedience to God. While the Libertines believed that they could practice their immorality and still come to the Lord's Supper, and Calvin refused to serve communion to these Libertines. And in that time, the church insisted that Calvin serve communion. Well, after the sermon was delivered, Calvin saw that the Libertines were present there in the sanctuary that morning. So he spread out his arms over the communion table, and he said something to the effect of, "You can take my life, you can chop off my arms, you can have my very blood and my life, but I will not serve what is sacred to those who are going to profane the good name of God." Nearby Calvin's cathedral is the place where Calvin lived. It's called Rue de Jean Calvin today. It was a house. The house is no longer there. It's been replaced by something else. But Calvin lived at this home, and he actually eventually died in this home as well. Nearby that home is a fountain from where he would have drawn his water, like all the other citizens and residents of his community. So that's Calvin's church, St. Pierce Cathedral. That's his home. And we'll take a tour now of the Reformation Wall, which is here nearby Calvin's church. We are standing here at the Reformation Wall in Geneva. It's just a short walk from St. Pierce Cathedral and from John Calvin's house. This wall commemorates the history of the Reformation, not just in Geneva, but in Holland and Scotland as well. If you scroll over this way, you see there's a monument over there to Luther. He's not commemorated on the wall because his monument is actually in Worms, so he's commemorated elsewhere. But far to my right is the date 1536, which of course is the date that the citizens of Geneva voted to adopt Protestantism as their official religion. And then as you come down, you see other figures, early figures in the Reformation. But the wall itself centers on these four figures: Calvin, Farel, Beza, and John Knox, and each of them in their own way contributed to the Reformation here in Geneva. You'll notice that each of the figures has a Bible in their hands, and that of course is a way to show that the Reformation was an effort to bring the Catholic Church, or the church at the time, back to what Scripture was teaching. And so the Reformation was rooted in Scripture. Interesting thing, you'll notice a couple things. On the far left is Guillaume Farel, and you'll notice that he has a Bible in one hand, but his fist is clenched, and that's probably because Farel was known as a pretty intense individual. He's the one that warned Calvin that he would be putting a curse on him if Calvin did not stay in Geneva to help with the Reformation. The other thing you'll notice is that Calvin's head is leaned forward from the wall, and that's a way of emphasizing Calvin's significance and his importance in the Reformation. One final note about the wall: you'll notice that the words "Post Tenebrae Lux" are written all the way across.
the wall, and that's one of the slogans of the Reformation, which is "After the darkness, light," and that was a way of emphasizing how after the time of the Catholic Church and the abuses of power within the Catholic Church, then God actually brought the light of the Reformation and renewal within His church.